So, like I said, my name is Dr. Milanovich. I grew up in the Detroit area, and I didn't really get involved in wildlife until I was in college. And once I finished college, then I went on to grad school, continued to study amphibians throughout my whole career, and I worked for the government for a bit, and then was lucky enough to find a faculty job at Loyola. So here at Loyola, my lab focuses on studying amphibians in the wild and what's going on with them, what sort of threats are faced with them, and what sort of functions they provide ecosystems. So here's some members of my lab that I wanted to introduce you to. Come on up, Armand.
Hi, I'm Armand.
This is Armand. He's my grad student. Mike.
Hey guys,
this is Mike. He's my other grad student. Izzy's an undergraduate here working. Say hi. Okay, say bye.
Hi guys.
See ya. That's just this portion of my lab. They do a lot of great work, and they're really fun to be around. And the great thing about being a college professor working on amphibians is that a lot of my students get to be involved in the work, really hands-on. So they're scientists as well, just like I am. So let's see. It looks like we don't have any questions yet. So I'll start going forward with this presentation. What we're going to talk about is amphibians in general and some of the threats that amphibians are faced with, or what could be wrong with them across the world. And if there's any questions throughout the presentation, just go ahead and pop them up. I'll keep looking down and I'll answer them as they come in. And then we should have some time at the end as well to finish up. Okay, so if you don't know anything about amphibians, this is how cool they are. There's about 7,800, almost 8,000 species of amphibians globally. Most of those are frogs. So frog diversity, what we call, that means the number of species is really, really high. And it makes up most of the amphibians in the world, about 88%. Then we have another group called newts and salamanders. And there's about 700 or so, 10 species of those. Then there's this really unique group that lives in more tropical regions of Central and South America that are called caecilians. There's about 200 or so species of them. The really cool thing about amphibians, this is one of the coolest, is that they've been on Earth and their ancestors for over 300 million years. So whatever happened to the dinosaurs that made them go extinct, all these little frogs and toads and salamanders running around have gone through that as well. We have our first question. Reptiles and amphibians are confusing. How do you know which one is which? Well, there's a couple different ways to tell. The best way is to look at their skin. So amphibian skin is generally really moist, and it's what we call permeable. It has holes in it. So that's just a different evolutionary path that they took, where they have really moist skin. Reptiles generally have tougher skin, harder skin, and a lot of times it's actually waterproof. So if you have a snake or a frog in your hand, you can physically feel the difference of their skin types. Then what we also see is the way they lay their eggs is different. Most reptiles have an egg with a shell on it, and they usually lay their eggs underground, sometimes in sand or in the sediments, and they need that protection for their eggs so they don't dry out. Most amphibians, and we'll talk about all this in a little more detail, amphibians generally lay their eggs in water, or they have some sort of protective jelly coating around it. And some amphibians even protect their eggs. So the best way to tell a difference is looking at their skin. Most reptiles, if not all, will have really tough, hard skin. Amphibians have really moist, permeable skin. Okay. So what you see in the pictures here at the bottom, those are 3 species of salamander. You can find 2 of these in Illinois, where I am now, and the third one, the red salamander, you can find in the eastern United States. But you can see that there's just a lot of variation in what amphibians look like, and we'll see throughout the talk that there is considerable variation in what they do and how they act and how they respond to change. So if you want to know more about amphibians, there's this really neat website. It's called amphibiaweb.org. There's a link right there. And they have species accounts. They have descriptions of all these different types of amphibians that live in the United States and even in Canada. And you can read all about them, see really cool pictures that scientists post, and there's even some interactive tools there as well. So what this figure is showing you here is the amphibian diversity around the world. This is how many species of amphibians live in all these different regions of the world. And if you look closely, these darker regions of the world, or the regions that are more purple or reds, they have higher number of species of amphibians. They have lots and lots of different types of them. And you can see that most of the amphibian diversity, most of the amphibian species that live on Earth are really congregated in these kind of tropical regions. And if you follow the equator across the Earth there, you'll see that Central and South America and Southeast Asia are really what we call hotspots of biodiversity for amphibians. There's lots and lots of species. What we'll talk a bit about today is the United States. We have quite a few species here, and in the Appalachian Highlands and the Pacific Northwest, there's really hotspots of diversity amphibians there as well. There's lots and lots of species. This is a really cool picture that my friend Bill took. He's another scientist who works for Ohio State University. This is of a new species of salamander that we discovered, and it was a really cool story, really unique story. Bill found it on the side of a road, and we worked together with a bunch of different scientists to come together and describe the species. No one had ever known about it, and no scientist had ever described it as a species. It was never known. And it's called the patch-nosed salamander. If you want to look it up, we're on AmphibiaWeb as well. The really cool thing about this picture is that this is a female that has eggs in her belly, and she's wrapped around a dime. So it's one of the smallest salamanders in the world, and it's a really, really cool species. It was so unique that we had to describe it as a new genus, which is even deeper evolutionary than a species. So really cool. Check out the patch-nosed salamander. We found it on the side of the road in Georgia, in the United States, just about 10 or so years ago, which is pretty darn cool. So why are amphibians so cool? Okay, there's a couple of reasons. The main one that I think is that they're really diverse. There's lots and lots of different types of amphibians, and they all do different things. So they all either live in water, some live in the land only. They can brumate and hibernate, and they could deal with toxins. They have all these different ways of laying eggs and protecting their young sometimes. And there's just so many different cool things that occur with them and that they've evolved to have throughout their lives. The other cool thing is that they're really abundant. When you think about how an organism might impact the environment, generally it's either something that's really big or has a big impact. Let's say like an elephant. Elephants are huge, so just to be an elephant you have to run around, you have to eat a bunch of stuff, you're creating habitat by making these big wallows, so you have these big effects on the ecosystem. So that's one way of doing it, is just being really large. Another way is being really small and having a lot of you around, being really abundant. That's generally what we see amphibians do, is when an amphibian lays eggs, sometimes there could be thousands of eggs in that one breeding event, that one clutch. And all those babies are hatching out with all these different females laying eggs, and you get this big influx of these species. Generally, they're also really small too, and they're what we call poikilothermic or ectothermic. So they don't need a lot of energy. They're not producing their own body heat. So if you don't do that, then you can actually slow your life down a bit. You can eat a lot less, and you just have to keep your environmental conditions correct, and you can live a pretty long time. So that allows these amphibians to really be really abundant in the environment. They grow really fast. There's lots of species, and there's lots of individuals in each species. Okay, we got a really cool question, and that is asking whether or not bright amphibians are poisonous, and the general answer to that is yes. It gets a little more complicated. So most amphibians that are really bright or have really bright coloration are either poisonous themselves. So the classic example is the poison dart frogs, and those are really unique South American species. They actually accumulate poisons from what they eat. There are other species, though, that have what's called aposematic coloration, and that's just making these bright colorations on their body. And sometimes they do that because they're poisonous. Other times they do it because they want to imitate something that's poisonous. They want to pretend that they're poisonous. So I would say amphibians that have coloration that is bright, it's probably 50-50. A lot of them are probably poisonous, and a lot of them are probably just acting like they are. So let's continue talking about these amphibians and why they're so cool. This is a really cool species that I work on. This is called the slimy salamander, and the name is totally appropriate. If you handle these, they excrete this slime from their body that makes your hands real sticky. I mean, really sticky. And it's a defense mechanism. But the slimy salamander is cool because, in a large part, they're really big players in ecosystems. They're really tremendously abundant in forest. These species are really cool in addition because they're lungless. They don't have any lungs, and they're really small. They don't need to eat a lot every year because they're lungless. They're not producing their own body heat as well. So they live in these kind of underground caverns and in the leaf litter in the forest. And they're so abundant that some of the studies I've done show that if you weigh up, if you just get all the salamanders in an area and you weigh them up, that amount of salamanders, their weight, would actually outweigh birds, small mammals, and sometimes even deer. So there could be so many of these species and individuals in a given area that they can actually have huge biomass. That's one of the reasons why they can have these big impacts on ecosystems, and we'll talk about it in a bit, is that there's so many of them, and counting them is really tough. But what we can estimate is that in some areas that are really rich in species or have good habitat, these things can outweigh all these different charismatic species. Another couple of reasons why amphibians are so cool is because they have really different what we call life histories. And what we mean by that is that, in part, they have all these different ways to reproduce. And typically you think of amphibians as laying eggs in water, which is true a lot of the times. But what we also have is amphibians that are totally terrestrial. They live on land entirely. The amphibians that live in water are called biphasic amphibians. These are what you typically see. A frog that's an adult will go into the water and lay eggs. Those eggs will hatch into little tadpoles. You turn into then a froglet, or a little metamorphic frog, and that frog can then grow up into adult in the terrestrial world. That's called biphasic because part of their life is in the water, part of their life is in the land. We see this with frogs. A lot of salamanders do this as well. These are called pond-breeding salamanders. You can find these in Illinois, where they'll lay these egg clutches, and the salamanders will grow up in the water, and then they'll metamorph out and live on land the rest of their life. We also see a different strategy with those lungless salamanders. This is a slimy salamander that I caught, and this one, in these groups of species that don't have lungs, oftentimes they will lay their eggs on land. And they'll lay them in little grape clusters like you see in the bottom right there, and they'll actually protect their eggs from other females or males roaming around or other insects that want to eat them. And once the eggs hatch, they all leave and spread out around the area. So we have a few questions. Let's start from the top here and see if I can get them answered. Okay, so someone asked that I didn't study amphibians till college, so what caught my interest in them? Well, I'll tell you that it was really one of my professors in college. So like I mentioned, I grew up in the Detroit area, and I will say that I had a tough time getting into colleges, but once I did, I started to really kind of show my interest in biology in general. And one of my professors for a class studied reptiles and amphibians. So he started telling me about them more, and started showing me them more, and I just started getting interested in them. Then what I did was I was able to get an internship in college where I went and worked for a national park. And the whole summer I caught turtles and snakes and frogs, and that was my job. And I just completely fell in love with it, and I never looked back. That's how it's been ever since. Okay, We have another question. How do reptiles bury their eggs, and where do the eggs come out of the reptile's body? So that's a great question. So reptiles generally bury their eggs in a couple different ways, and it kind of depends. If you look at turtles, which are a characteristic reptile organism, they will actually bury their eggs either in the sand if they're a sea turtle, or sometimes in the dirt next to like a pond or a lake. And what they generally do is they dig a hole first. The female comes and digs a huge hole, and then the eggs come out of what's called the cloaca. And it's basically this organ right at the end of their tail, and that's where they lay their eggs. That's where they will reproduce. That's where they go to the bathroom. It's kind of a catch-all organ. So they'll actually deposit their eggs in the ground, and then the females will bury their eggs again. If you look at something like a snake, then they do something similar in the sense of they can lay their eggs in the leaf litter sometimes. They can lay their eggs in little burrows that other organisms use and that they kind of stole. Lizards oftentimes will go into like rock crevices or under rocks and lay their eggs. So it's just kind of a mixture on what type of reptile is and how they lay them. Okay. We have another question. What color are the non-poisonous reptiles and amphibians? Well, you know, there's a lot of diversity in reptiles and amphibians, and what you generally see is that the coloration is all over the place. So most, I would say, organisms in the United States, most species of amphibians in the United States are generally either green or brown or even sometimes black or darker in color, because most of the time they just want to blend in. They don't want to be caught or captured. And if you're out during the daytime at all, like a lot of frogs are, then you want to kind of blend into the water. So you want to kind of be green or brown. A lot of other species can actually mimic the color of poisonous ones like we talked about. If you don't do that, then generally you're some sort of black or yellow or green or brown. Okay, we have a question about salamanders. Okay, and I think the question's asking with salamanders specifically, why am I so interested in them? And the reason is I think they're really unique. I study mostly the salamanders that don't have lungs, which you can't get cooler than that. But also, a lot of my work looks at how these organisms impact ecosystems and how they function in ecosystems and how they help forests grow and other processes. So that makes really things pretty interesting to me. I also think that you know, amphibians are under peril in a lot of ways, and we'll talk about this in a bit. But there's a lot of things that threaten them, and they're actually not doing so great. So trying to understand their biology and their populations and what they do and where they are is really important still. Okay. So I'll answer a few more questions, and then I'll keep going. Why do tadpoles hatch in water? Well, tadpoles hatch in water because their parents laid them there, basically. So they've evolved to hatch out in water, and they have all these different characteristics. They have gills usually. Their teeth are set up just to eat algae, and it's basically the evolution of the species that live in water and lay eggs in water. It just sort of is the best life history strategy for them. So tadpoles hatch in water really just because their parents laid them there, and that's what they've evolved to live with. Okay, do amphibians have teeth? So some do, actually. It's pretty cool. A lot of amphibians that eat insects don't generally have teeth, but some of them will have keratin, kind of like your fingernails, that form these kind of structures like teeth in their body. So a lot of the lungless salamanders that I study, they'll actually have these ridges of that keratin on their upper and lower jaws, and you can consider them teeth for sure. Okay, another question here. Are there any blue amphibians? And yes, there are. There's several species of frogs in the tropics that are what you consider blue color, indigo color, and sometimes even like a bullfrog in the United States can turn blues too. So there's a lot of variation. Okay. Let's keep going here. So another reason why amphibians are so cool, and this is another reason why they're under threat, is that they actually have permeable skin. That means there's lots of holes in their skin. So whatever's in the environment around amphibians, they generally have a pretty hard time keeping it out of their body. So when we talk about some of the threats, we'll talk about pollutants and these other climate change factors. And amphibians have a tough time with those because a lot of what's in the surrounding area enters their body through their skin. And that's a big way that they actually breathe too. Okay, so why are amphibians declining now? So the title of this talk is how amphibians and global change have occurred. And so I want to spend some time talking about amphibians in general. What scientists have realized recently is that amphibians are undergoing what's considered a mass extinction event. So historically in the world, if you look at this graph here, if you look at the number of families here, that's basically the number of organisms around the world. And at the bottom there, we're looking at this millions and millions of years, about 600 million years ago. And what we're seeing through time is that there's a lot of species some points in time, and then a lot of species will die off at other points. And historically, this has happened millions and millions of years ago. And it's happened 5 times, so from what we can see from the fossil record, that you have these big mass extinction events. The last one was in the late Cretaceous period. That's when the dinosaurs died. A big asteroid hit the Earth, it blocked out the sun, caused a number of other climatic effects, and you had a lot of organisms on Earth die off about 65 million years ago. So we consider a mass extinction something where you have this big extinction events across all these different species. And what we're seeing today with amphibians and fish is that these species in particular are undergoing these mass extinction events. They're dying at really, really fast rates, faster than what's normal. So let's talk a bit about this a little bit more. What we know now is about a third, about one out of every 3 amphibian species are at risk of extinction. That means they could go extinct within our lifetime. What we see is that the extinction rate of amphibians is about 25 to 45,000 times higher than the normal rate of extinction, the background rate. What scientists are able to do through the fossil record is calculate how often species should go extinct in the world. And it's usually about 1 to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 species a year. And amphibians are a lot higher than that. And we also have shown that about 170 or so species have gone extinct in the past 2 decades of amphibians. So they're really under peril for a lot of different threats. We have another question here. Do all these animals, these amphibians, leave their young after they hatch? Why do some, like sea turtles, leave their eggs instead of staying around to protect them? So that's a good question. So a lot of amphibians, and you can argue that most amphibians do actually leave their eggs and their young completely. They lay the eggs and they leave them. And there are some species though that do stay around and protect them. If you talk about like sea turtles, which are a reptile, then what they have developed basically is a strategy to lay a bunch of eggs and put all of their energy and time and effort into making as many eggs as possible, then laying those eggs and spending the rest of their energy preparing for making another clutch of eggs in the next year or a few months later. So it's really just an energy strategy that species have adapted to utilize, where you can either have fewer eggs or make your eggs bigger, or you can take care of them, or you can lay a bunch of eggs all at once and not take care of them. And in the end, what we see with a lot of these amphibians and reptiles that lay a bunch of eggs and don't protect their eggs or don't take care of their young is that a lot of them do die, but they lay so many of those eggs that a couple of those little babies will survive to adulthood. And when you have a lot of species and a lot of organisms, a lot of individuals per species, then we see that that's effective with keeping populations sizable. And it's just worked for them for hundreds of millions of years to do that. So really, that's a good question. Okay, we have a question here about what's called chytrid fungus in the United States, and we can revisit that because we're going to talk about chytrid fungus coming up in the talk here. So hopefully your question will get answered in a bit. So another question was, why does the rate of extinction increase so much in the recent decades? And that's really what the remainder of the talk will discuss, is why amphibians are going extinct faster than a lot of other animals. Okay, so this will answer the second question there, and again we'll loop back to the chytrid fungus. Why are amphibians declining? Okay, like I said, they're undergoing the 6th mass extinction event in the world, and here are the different causes. We're going to talk about each of these separately. Habitat destruction is one of them, so we're destroying a lot of forest in the world. We're converting a lot of other habitat to, let's say, a lot of forest in the world. We're converting a lot of other habitat to, let's say, urbanization or towns and cities. We are converting a lot of land for agriculture, so we're growing a lot of crops in places that we haven't grown them recently. We also see that amphibians have a lot of diseases that are approaching, and these seem to be somewhat novel diseases, and they're pretty nasty. We'll talk about those. We also see humans introducing a lot of pollutants to the land, and we talked about amphibians having trouble with those. We know that global climate change is occurring, and it's starting to really impact amphibians in ways that we didn't really expect. Then we also see that there's a growing pet trade in what's called overexploitation of amphibians. A lot of countries will actually eat them pretty regularly, and as populations grow and we have to feed more people, we see that it's this combination of eating a lot of amphibian species, going out to areas that are shrinking from habitat destruction, and then also this kind of pet trade question is also starting to lead somewhat to the decline of amphibians. All right, let's talk about habitat destruction a little bit here. So what these pictures are showing you here are 2 different kind of areas, one of which is an area that looks like it may have historically been forest. You can see some forest in the background. Then it's been converted to cropland. And the one on the right there is looking at this kind of network of prairies, and some of them are being kind of cut down. So what we generally see with amphibians is that they've adapted to live in these really certain environments. Some live in forest, and they need wetlands sometimes, or water. Some of them need to be in like prairie habitat, and all these different kind of habitats that they live in. And this happens a lot with other species as well. So it doesn't just stick with amphibians, but as you start converting that habitat, if you take a forest and you cut it down, whatever species live there can't live there anymore. And also what you see is that as you shrink that amount of habitat that they have, their populations start declining. It also makes it harder for them to get to other habitats, especially amphibians. When you have really porous skin, you have to stay wet and moist almost all the time. So if you lived in a really wet forest and you had to cross a really dry area to get to another forest, they might not make it. So that's another issue that they have, is habitat fragmentation, where you're not allowing these connections of different types of habitat to each other that these amphibians can cross over. So really just the loss of habitat is a big issue with amphibian species. Okay, we also see that amphibians are declining from disease. And there's a couple different diseases that have occurred. The first of which is called BD, or that's the chytrid fungus. And the chytrid fungus, if you can see this picture here, was first documented in South and Central America, on the really western side of Central America. And the fungus would basically move eastward to this kind of central South American area, and as it would move every year, we get these really big die-offs of amphibians. Chytrid's really nasty in the sense that it's a fungal infection that these amphibians get, and once they get it, it kind of clogs up their pores of their skin in part, and does a bunch of other things that aren't really nice to it. But it kills a lot of species. Very few species can live with chytrid when it's what we call active. So what we notice is that chytrid is actually found almost everywhere. You can find chytrid in Illinois here, but a lot of times it's not really toxic. It's not killing them. So there's some relationship with the environment, and we think it might be climate change driven. It might be with certain kind of variations in the chytrid fungus. We're not quite sure what it is, but it's some relationship with the environment that makes this fungus really toxic sometimes, where it isn't other times. And it seems more in the warmer areas we have it more toxic. So chytrid started, we really noticed it in the early 1980s, and since then it has moved across Central America and really caused this big havoc in that area, among other areas in the world. Another unique fungus that's found recently is called B-sal, and that's another fungal infection, and it's most commonly found in Europe now. It's currently, to my knowledge, not in the United States, and we're trying to keep it that way as much as we can. But it acts similarly to chytrid in the sense that it infects amphibians that live in the water generally, and the spores kind of become activated, and it really wreaks havoc on a lot of salamander species in Europe, which is pretty bad. We also see there's another virus called the ranavirus that's affecting amphibians, and the picture on the right there is showing you a big die-off of frogs that got infected with the ranavirus. And this is something that is also found a lot of times in water-dwelling amphibians, and it's really weird. It's really episodic, where one pond can have a die-off from ranavirus, and the pond a couple hundred meters over won't have it. So we're not quite sure exactly what is causing these still. There's still a lot of research, and there's some great scientists working on it really closely. But these are all really alarming in big ways, and amphibians aren't doing so well. Okay, keep those questions in. All right, let's talk about pollutants. So what humans also do to the landscape is we make a lot of different chemicals. And a lot of times these chemicals can enter into either the waterway, or we can put them in forests sometimes. And we see that it actually can impact a lot of these amphibian species in a couple different ways. One of which is if the pollutants are in high enough concentration, or if they're truly toxic, then it can kill amphibians directly. It can cause death right away. Another way that it can alter them is it can change how they develop. So if you're a frog living in water and that pollutant comes in the water, it might not kill the frogs directly, but it might not kill the eggs directly, but it might start switching how those eggs can develop. It might start creating mutations in these frogs. So that middle picture is showing you the tiger salamander, or a leopard frog, and it has another leg growing out of its body. And that was caused a lot of times by certain pollutants that can alter how a frog grows up when it's a baby. We also see that a lot of these chemicals can actually change the sex of a frog. It can turn male frogs into females, and sometimes you can even turn female frogs into male frogs. So it can switch the populations of frogs to be a higher probability of female or higher probability of male. And again, it's this developmental issue where the toxin in the water is changing how the frog can actually develop. So that's pretty nasty stuff as well. Okay, another issue that we see is that global climate change is occurring and starting to impact amphibians quite a bit. So what we generally see occurring right now is amphibians are changing the kind of life history that they have. They're changing when they come up from their hibernation and brumation in the winter. They're changing when they breed because it's a little bit warmer in the winter, or it's a little bit cooler in the fall, or it's warmer earlier in the summer. So they're starting to kind of change and react to climate change by what's called these phenology, these phenological differences. That just means that they're changing what they're doing when they're doing it. What we also see is that since amphibians can't really move very fast, and most of them can't move very far, we're predicting that climate change will alter where these frogs and salamanders and other amphibians can live. So if you think about an amphibian, they breathe through their skin, they need to stay wet and moist all the time, they don't move very far generally. So they're kind of like trees. They're kind of stuck in these places. So if you change the habitat or the climate changes, then they can't really get away very fast. They can't fly away like a bird. So this is some pictures here of the Midwest where I live now, and it's showing you that the number of species of amphibians will change based on climate change. This is what we predict. So we can actually make these really fancy models that will show you where all these species live with current climate, and then as the climate changes, we can change where all these different species live. So what we see is that if there's less change based on climate change, that's what this picture here is showing you, we see that there's a lot of species still left. The red areas are really high species diversity. A lot of amphibians in terms of species live in these areas. And if you get more and more into change in the climate, how we suspect we are, we see that these red areas start decreasing and the blue areas in the Midwest start increasing. So we suspect that more or less physiologically they just won't be able to tolerate these warmer conditions or drier conditions or the combination of both as the climate will change. Okay, keep those questions going. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the pet trade and overexploitation. What we've seen in the past is that the collection of amphibians has become really popular, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It offers a lot of educational opportunities, and more exposure to these amphibians is always a great idea. What we see sometimes, though, is that the pet trade can actually take species that are extinct or that are threatened, or there's not many of them left, and they can take them from the wild. So that's one of the issues that we see. Overexploitation is something where we see a lot of these species will actually be eaten at faster rates than they can reproduce. So a lot of Southeast Asian countries and a lot of African countries, we see that these species are used by people as food resource. And it's always been that way, but as the numbers start declining for all these other different reasons based on like climate change and disease and pollutants and people cutting down their habitat, then we see that when you start taking them from the wild, that has a bigger effect than it used to. All right. So we have a good question here. Where are most amphibians dying? So that's a good question, and I would say the best answer is in these tropical areas. From what we can tell, there's still a lot of species in the tropics, and we're still describing species. But it seems like this combination of changing their landscape, so cutting down forest or altering the land for agriculture, has really increased in tropical areas. We also see that a lot of the amphibian diseases that are pretty virulent, that kill them a lot, are in the tropical areas. We also see that overexploitation a lot of times is in tropical regions as well. But that's not to say that they are not declining in the United States. The amphibians in general in the United States are doing okay, but they still have a lot of threats to them. We're positive we've lost species, we're losing a lot of individuals. We're converting a lot of their habitat. So really across the world, amphibians are not doing great. They still need a lot of help. But if you had to pick one area, I would say that the tropics is the area that I would worry most about them. Okay, so amphibians are declining. So what does it mean, right? We might not have frogs around, and we might not have salamanders to look at, and all this kind of stuff. But it also means that there might be this big change in ecosystems. So amphibians are actually really good food for other animals. And here's a snake eating a frog, a bird eating a frog. You can go on and on and on. So amphibians are really good prey. They are generally pretty small. There's a lot of them. They're basically little packets of fat and protein, so they're really good at acquiring energy and holding into their bodies. And when you have millions of those throughout the landscape, they're a really good food resource. So this is something that hasn't been quantified really at all in the scientific world. We don't know how much frogs and salamanders and other amphibians are feeding other organisms, or how much other organisms rely on them for food, but we suspect that it's pretty important. Okay, so here's another question. Which of the reasons for the threat do you think is most damaging to amphibian populations? So diseases or habitat loss? Well, the common thought is that habitat destruction, removing habitat, is the biggest threat to most species, including amphibians, and that has to slow down for a lot of the species on Earth, including amphibians, to survive really well. So I would say that's probably the most pressing threat for amphibians is habitat fragmentation, or destruction, or removing their habitat. All right, so let's keep talking about why else amphibians are really unique and helpful to the environment. So another thing that we're realizing is that they're really important for what we call ecosystem functions. They help ecosystems work and operate, and they help them become healthy and stay healthy. And here's one of the ways that they do this. So if you look at the salamander here, the salamander is going to eat a lot of different bugs. That's almost always amphibians are eating bugs in some of their life stages. And if you see that this salamander is eating all these different bugs, these bugs might have a lot of different phosphorus in their body. That phosphorus is currently held in that bug, so no plants or other animals can take it. But the salamander is going to eat that phosphorus. It's going to digest that bug, take the phosphorus out. It's going to use some of it maybe for its bones or for other physiological functions, and then it's actually going to poop the rest out. So it's actually going to excrete some of that phosphorus. So what that amphibian is doing in the salamander, it's eating this bug in this what's called an organic form, and then it's excreting it out of its body in what's called an inorganic form. And in that inorganic form, plants can use it. Plants can uptake it and use it for growth. It can be taken up by a microbe. It has all these different options. So what we see, and this is just one of the ways that these amphibians can affect ecosystems, is that since there's so many of them, and since they're so small and they're all over the place, we see that they can actually recycle nutrients really well in ecosystems. There's this kind of pathway for nutrients and energy between lower trophic levels like microbes and plants and upper trophic levels like us. We also see that there's a number of medical advancements that amphibians have helped with. One of the cool things is looking at these poison dart frogs. They have this particular poison that's in their skin that doesn't harm them, but harms something that eats them. And just the chemicals and the processes that they use to create that have helped with a lot of different drug advancements in the world. Another really unique thing about amphibians is a lot of them can actually regenerate body parts. They can regrow limbs and toes legs and arms and everything. So the process of that is really unique in the animal world, being able to regrow something, especially in a vertebrate, something that has a backbone. So that's another advancement that we're starting to explore more is how these amphibians regenerate growth and how they can be used in improving medicine. Okay, so just as I had hoped, we have about 10 or 15 or so minutes left for questions, so I'll hang out here and answer any questions that you all have. Thank you. Okay, here's a great question. Do amphibians eat other amphibians? The answer is yes, absolutely. There are actually some species of salamanders and some species of frogs that only eat other frogs or only other salamanders. So that's really great question. They actually can be what's called cannibalistic. And I would say a lot of species do this in either as babies they'll do it, or they'll do it as adults too. So yeah, it's a good question. They do. All right. So what projects do I have going on right now is another question. Well, I have a couple projects going on right now. One of which is we are looking at how amphibians live on golf courses. So in the Chicago area where I live, there's lots and lots of golf courses. So we're looking at if amphibians live there and how many and what they're doing. We're also looking at how amphibians are affected by pesticides. So if pesticides get in the water, we're asking how amphibians are affected by those. The third project I have with amphibians is looking at lungless salamanders, those really cool salamanders with no lungs. They live in the Appalachian Mountains pretty regularly, and if you look at the diversity of those, they're really highest in the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee, North Carolina. So I have another project where we're looking at how climate change and how fire actually impacts those species in the Appalachians. So I have a lot of amphibian work going on. It's pretty fun. All right. All right, so another question is how long do frog legs grow? And that's a good question. Usually, if you look at most frogs, what you consider just a good old frog, like a bullfrog, the leg is usually about the length of the body, or even a little bit longer. And if you want to know some of the biggest frogs, like the Goliath frog or a cane toad, they can have legs that could be, I would say, at least 6 or 8 inches, sometimes maybe even a foot long. So frog legs can grow real big. Okay. Do you think amphibians can evolve to the changing environment? That's a great question. And I do think they can. So the reason I do believe that is that they have in the past. So amphibians have been on Earth for about 315 or so million years, and they have this big history of evolution. So I think that they have the ability to evolve to the climate as it changes. One of the issues that we may run into is that the climate today is changing a lot faster than it has in the past. So that's one of the issues, is whether or not they can speed up how fast they evolve to the changing climate. That we don't know. We know that they can evolve if given time, and we suspect that they will, but probably not all species and probably not everywhere. So that's a good question. The rate of climate change is really fast now. It's hard to compare it to anything else that's happened in history. Okay, we have a few more questions. How closely related are amphibians to crocodiles and alligators? That's a really good question, and I would say they're really distantly related. So the split between amphibians and reptiles or crocodiles or turtles happened several and reptiles or crocodiles or turtles happened several 100 million years ago. So you could argue that a crocodile, definitely a snake, is more closely related to a bird than it is an actual amphibian. Even though we study them together, they're not really closely related at all. All right, we have some more questions here. So people use aquatic macroinvertebrates, those are little bugs, to determine pollution levels and health of waterways. Can amphibians be used to calculate the health of an ecosystem like macroinvertebrates? And that's a great question. I would say yes, and it also depends a lot. Some amphibians are actually really tolerant to environmental change, so bullfrogs can live in habitat that a lot of other species would consider to be toxic. Other amphibian species are a lot more sensitive. Either they're sensitive to change or pollutants, or they need a specific type of environment. So using amphibians as like a canary in a coal mine, I think is a good option, and it depends on what you're looking at and where. But in general, I would say that the rate of amphibians going extinct right now is alarming enough that we should start paying attention to not only amphibians declining, but what that means for humans. Okay, here's another good question. Do you believe there are many similarities between amphibians and macroinvertebrates? And again, those are bugs or insects that you can see. I would say that there are similarities. A lot of insects and other bugs and crustaceans, these macroinvertebrates, are ectothermic or poikilothermic, so they get all of their heat source from the environment. They can't make their heat internally, so they're similar in that way. I would also say that they're similar because there's a lot of them. There's a lot of amphibians, there's a lot of insects around, a lot of crustaceans. So they have this kind of same lifestyle where they produce a lot of young, they produce a lot of individuals, and they have kind of similar physiologies in the sense that they're not making their own body heat. Okay, how do we solve the amphibian systems and population? So how do we save amphibians? I think that's what the question's asking. Well, there's a couple ways. A lot of it is dealing with just making sure they have enough habitat. So if we stop or reduce the amount of forests that we're cutting down, or how much land we're converting for agriculture, if we set aside these areas for these amphibians to live, I think that will help quite a bit. In addition, I think if we start minimizing how much chemicals and pollutants we put in the environment, and we start regulating that, that'll help a bit. We could also find ways to try to help them out with diseases. A lot of these fungal diseases might have a cure there. We're still exploring options for that. So those are three good ways, and really just treating them with respect. Respecting these species for what they provide us is a good way to kind of view it. All right. So we have another great question here. How have amphibians survived since the days of dinosaurs? Well, they've done it a lot of different ways. That's the best way to put it. They have developed abilities to burrow down in the ground for years. They have developed abilities to lay a lot of eggs, to hide out in places, to use very little resources. They've just been really innovative. So they've lived quite a long time because of that. You can call it luck, but mostly it's just them being really good at adapting to different changes. All right. Okay, we have about 5 or so more minutes. It seems like a lot of classes are changing over, ending the day. Thank you for coming out. It was a great time. I'll hang out for another 3 or 4 minutes or so if you have any other questions. Okay, looks like that's it. Thank you all.